2020 has been a big year for reboots of beloved franchises. The Hunger Games finally got a new book, a full decade after the last book in the series came out, and don't worry, I'm not going to give you any spoilers about it here because I haven't read it yet. It's called The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, and it's a prequel. It's a villain origin story for President Snow, and I have had to mute so many words on Twitter to avoid spoilers. I don't know how much longer I can keep getting away with it. You've probably also heard that Twilight is getting a follow-up, 12 years after the last book in that series, Breaking Dawn, came out, though only 5 years since Stephanie Meyer released her gender-swapped Twilight reimagining Life and Death that came out in 2015. But now Stephanie Meyer is finally publishing Midnight Sun, and those of you who are hardcore Twilight fans back in the day, as I very much was, will remember that Midnight Sun was going to be a reimagining of Twilight from Edward's perspective, but after the first chapter got leaked online, Stephanie Meyer abandoned the project, and we were all heartbroken, and now it's finally coming out. And outside the book world, it's also just been announced that we are getting another Legally Blonde sequel. So like I said, 2020 is the year of the reboots. But in this video, I wanted to ask your thoughts on whether you think that book reboots ever actually live up to the original. And I would love to hear your thoughts on this, so please let's get debating in the comments. So for example, a really hyped reboot from last year was, of course, The Testaments, Margaret Atwood's follow-up to The Handmaid's Tale, a massive 34 years after that original book came out, and it was really well received. So it had this really exciting publicity campaign that started when Vintage just shared solid green blocks across all their social media to hint that something was coming, and the excitement just kept building. Nobody could stop talking about this book, and it did of course go on to jointly win the Booker Prize with Girl, Woman, Other. So a massive success. And another really famously well-received one is Doctor Sleep, which is Stephen King's follow-up to The Shining 36 years after he published that book. And this one is about Danny, the child from the original The Shining, now as this psychologically traumatized adult with psychic abilities. And the book shot to the top of the New York Times bestseller list and went on to win the 2013 Bram Stoker Award for Best Novel in the Horror Genre. A more controversial reboot happened in 2015 when Go Set a Watchman came out by Harper Lee, 55 years after To Kill a Mockingbird. And the controversy here was whether or not the book was in fact a sequel to Kill a Mockingbird, or actually more of a first draft, with a lot of things significantly changed. Either way, Go Set a Watchman is a really interesting novel that's largely about race, though fans of To Kill a Mockingbird did find it quite hard to read because the character of Atticus Finch is really different in this novel. This version is a much more racist character. He associates with the KKK, could not be more different than the beloved version of Atticus Finch who made it into To Kill a Mockingbird. Something else really fun is when a sequel or reinterpretation of a book is written by a brand new author. So Beyond Platform 13 by Sybil Pounder is a really good example of this. This one is a lovely children's adventure story that's written as a sequel to the original Secret of Platform 13 by Ava Ibbotson, and written by an author who is herself a massive fan of Ava Ibbotson, so it's kind of this celebration of 25 years since the original. For an even bigger time gap, Dracula Undead was written 112 years after the original Dracula, and again there's a close connection between the authors. Dracula Undead was written by Dacre Stoker, who is the great-grandnephew of Bram Stoker. Dracula Undead is the official sequel to Dracula endorsed by the Stoker family, but Dacre Stoker also went on to write a book called Dracul, which is the prequel to Dracula. But then sometimes, when the rebooted books are written by a new author, they can be a bit more critical of the original. So a really famous and really good example here is Wide Sargasso Sea by Jean Rhys. This is a feminist, anti-colonial response to Jane Eyre, written 119 years after the original. This book retells the story of Mr. Rochester's mad wife, Bertha. Here we meet her as a Creole heiress named Antoinette, who ends up in this unhappy marriage with an Englishman who renames her Bertha, declares her mad, and, well, we know the rest. And then the final type of reboot I wanted to talk about is when a series gets rebooted a few times in different ways. So for a great example of this, let's look at Bridget Jones by Helen Fielding. So this actually started life as a newspaper column written by Helen Fielding but without a byline, so that it was seemingly these real stories of a young single woman in her 30s called Bridget Jones. And the column was so successful that Helen Fielding then turned it into 2 novels, Bridget Jones's Diary and Bridget Jones, The Edge of Reason. And side note, if we're being really pernickety, the books themselves are actually reimaginations of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice and Persuasion, respectively, so they're kind of already reboots. But anyway, these books were super popular, they were both turned into movies, and then a few years later, Helen Fielding rebooted her newspaper column, but this time diverging from the happy ending of the books and placing Bridget right back in the centre of a love triangle with Mark Darcy and Daniel Cleaver. Then there was another 8-year gap before Helen Fielding released a new Bridget Jones novel, Mad About the Boy, which basically ignored the intermediate newspaper column and worked as a straight sequel from the books, with Bridget Jones now being in her 50s. And then finally there was the third movie, Bridget Jones's Baby, which was mostly an adaptation of those intermediate newspaper columns, but with a few things changed all over again. So some of that is a bit confusing, but I think it's really fun being able to follow a beloved character like Bridget Jones in slightly different scenarios and see how differently her life might have turned out in each one. And I would love to hear your thoughts on all of this. Do book reboots ever live up to the original for you? Can sometimes a reinterpretation written later down the line actually be even better, or is it never quite the same as that first time you read it? And which are your favourite reboots or sequels? I would love to hear all of this. Do let us know, and then click through to browse our playlist full of videos all about classic books. Which ones of these do you think now need a reboot? See you next time.